Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. This is my third city and final city, at least in my official capacity here in India. And it's just been really an amazing opportunity to see this beautiful country and meet so many excellent and passionate folks that are working on these issues here in India. I'm going to talk for about 20-30 minutes, but feel free if there are questions during that time to interject, and I want to keep this as conversational and informal as possible, and also kind of cater it to make sure that it is useful. Obviously, sustainability and urban sustainability is a very, very broad issue, and I want to cater it as much as possible to the things that you all are passionate about and concerned about here in your city. So I'm going to start by kind of giving an overview of the sort of general national perspective from the US on climate change currently, and talk about how the field of urban sustainability is taking shape in the US and really around the world for that matter. And then talk about some, I'm calling sustainability in action, some examples of policies and programs that are being rolled out in various cities across the US. And we'll have plenty of time for discussion afterwards as well. So as you know, our sort of national policy on climate has really taken a dramatic shift in the US under the leadership of President Trump. And it's unfortunate because it's a lot of people don't agree with it, and it's really seen as taking us a step backwards. But there's a clear sort of partisan divide, and this is a very political issue in the US. But what I want to emphasize is that even when you dig into that, there is still a lot of support on these issues. I think particularly if you notice here, 50% of Republicans support limiting greenhouse gas emissions, while 82% of Democrats do. And even despite the fact that only 20% view global climate change as a very serious problem. But if you get actually down to the people of the US, there is absolutely broad support and understanding that climate change is happening in the US. And this is across every single county and area in the city. You don't see one area that's in the blue shade that's below, actually, maybe there's one or two. But for the most part, over half of the country everywhere believes that climate change is happening. In total, 70% of adults in the US believe that it's happening. And then furthermore, the same goes for the support for the Paris Agreement. Despite the fact that President Trump has taken some steps to withdraw the United States from that agreement, that is in conflict with the fact that most of US residents strongly support the US's participation in the Paris Agreement. Within that, even a majority of the Republicans think that the US should be participating. So of all voters, I guess this is working. Okay. Of all registered voters, that's where about 70% support it. I don't really know what's happening with this thing. Of Democrats, it's about 86%. Of Republicans, 50%. But even when you look at the most conservative Republicans, 40% still support the US's participation in the Paris Agreement. And even furthermore, within Trump supporters, surprisingly, 47% actually support our participation in the Paris Agreement. So this is to say that, clearly there's broad support for the Paris Agreement and climate policy, but there's been a very effective and concerted effort amongst industry groups, particularly led by the Koch brothers, who are representative of the fossil fuel industry, that have made strategic investments in politicians to gain their support to kind of break down these sorts of agreements. But I don't think that's going to last. It really can't last. So the amount of support that we see in the US for these sorts of policies, particularly in the face of some of the really extraordinary natural disasters that the US is facing right now, from Houston to the impacts of the hurricanes in Florida. And so in response to that, cities have really stepped up to lead on these issues. Cities are, for one, they're typically sort of concentrated areas of sort of liberal and progressive thought. So there's a lot of support within these areas. But they're also, it's also really important that cities are involved in this conversation, because cities consume 2/3 of the world's resources and are responsible for over 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And clearly, as we see in India, cities are only growing, right? More and more people are living in urbanized areas and urban lifestyles. So cities have to be a part of the solution to these problems. They also present significant opportunities for low carbon and sustainable development, but we really need to be planning for that. I think it's often taken for granted that if people live in a city, they're going to not be driving as far. They may not need a car at all. They're going to be living in, multifamily buildings that are more energy efficient. But those things don't happen without planning and engaged citizens and people understanding these issues. So it needs to be taken into account. So when President Trump announced that the US would be pulling out of the Paris Agreement, I think the number is up to, the last I checked, is 377 US mayors who represent over 67 million people stepped up and said, okay, if the US at a national level isn't going to participate, as a city, we're going to still adhere to those agreements. So really kind of undercutting the president's and our national position on this issue. So I think that's, I like to communicate that point, because it's not a good feeling as a US citizen when our leadership is taking away, but just to show the support at a sort of human to human level that, we are working towards these issues, and we hope to really drive this work in the United States through working in cities. And cities are, because they have emerged as leaders in this space, they're starting to connect and organize with one another. As I mentioned, these mayors got together and said, we're all going to adhere to that. So it's kind of that mentality of collective action that will really make a difference. So individually, any given city might not make that much of an impact on the scale of global greenhouse gas emissions, but when you add it all together, it can be significant. And of course, that's where people are, right? And this is what it comes down to in a lot of ways, is about changing behaviors and impacting people and the way they interact with the environment. So cities need to be involved in that. So there's a number of organizations, some like the Urban Sustainability Directors Network are just operating in the US. Others like C40 and the 100 Resilient Cities effort are worldwide, and they're focused on collaborations amongst global mega cities. But these networks have really been instrumental in advancing the field of urban sustainability. My role with the city of Providence, where the Office of Sustainability is a very, very small office within the city, but that's because this work has to be operationalized within each of the departments. My office isn't gonna take on, the specific operations of managing a recycling program. That's Public Works Department, right? We're not going to take on transportation planning, because that's the transportation department. Our role is to really make sure that our sustainability goals that we set at the city level are being operationalized in those departments. And so each person in my position in various cities, we really rely on each other to share best practices and experiences. And it's been immensely helpful. And even coming here and talking to folks working on these issues in Indian cities, often you think, like, what challenges could we possibly have in common? But it's been really remarkable how similar these issues are. And the solutions are going to be different, of course, but they need to be brought into the local context and the local constraints and opportunities. But the challenges are really pretty similar. So it's incredibly helpful to be able to share ideas and strategies across different cities. So C40, as I mentioned, is working on a global level to provide this platform for cities to connect with one another. And there are a number of Indian cities that are a part of this effort, including Bangalore and Chennai locally. So that's potentially a good organization to be connecting with on these issues. And then 100 Resilient Cities as well. I recently, so this is focused on climate resilience and adapting to climate change. And I recently read in the news that Chennai actually just appointed its first Chief Resilience Officer. And that's what 100 Resilient Cities is hoping to do in all the cities that it's working with. is provide funding for these local governments to hire a chief resilience officer. So someone similar in my position is going to work across all departments in the city and coordinate a strategy to improve the resilience of each city. So as I mentioned, these organizations are really helping develop the field of urban sustainability. And this first, I believe the first sort of local plan on global climate change was in 2001 in Portland, at least in the US. And at that time, it was really this sort of kind of crazy thought that a city, a small, relatively small city, I believe there's 600,000 people in Portland, could or should be striving to address this global problem. But as it turns out, there, you know, like I said, there's a lot of support for this type of work at the city level. And there's so many co-benefits to this work. So even if you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you're cleaning up air quality, you're improving water quality, you're reducing traffic congestion, you're leading to more green space in cities for people to recreate and enjoy. So there's so many co-benefits at the local level that many other cities started following in these footsteps. And mayors have really become leaders on these issues because they get it. They see the tangible benefits of these issues, and it's where local governments are, you know, where the rubber meets the road. So it's an important place of action. And so these plans have become quite sophisticated over time. Plan NYC for New York City is a great example of how comprehensive these plans can be. So across the board, New York, Seattle, Washington, DC, Minneapolis, even small cities like Providence, where I work, are making these plans all across the city, or all across the country. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process, how these plans come to be, which also has really been developed into a pretty standard process. And it's very similar to any planning process or strategic planning process. You know, we're talking about long-term goals. Most cities have set goals to reduce carbon emissions 80% by 2050. And many have even set higher goals. The city of Providence, for example, has a goal to become carbon neutral by 2050. And recently I've even heard of some cities considering carbon negative goals. So how do we actually be a sequesterer of emissions? So the first step is you need to understand where your emissions are coming from. So in Providence, for example, the mayor set this goal to become carbon neutral by 2050. And the first thing we did, and so it's my job to figure out how we're going to do that. And the first thing we did was conduct a greenhouse gas inventory to understand where our emissions are coming from. From there, once you have that baseline inventory, you can start to set targets for various sectors. So you can set targets for transportation, buildings, et cetera, and then develop a plan to meet those targets at a sector by sector basis. And then, of course, implementation of that plan, and then monitoring progress and reporting that progress is the sort of final step that is really important. And it's a circular process. So as you're monitoring, you go back to your inventory maybe every 3 or 5 years, some cities every year, to check up on how you're doing. Are your emissions actually decreasing? Are you on track to meeting your targets? What actions have been implemented? What are lagging behind? So as I mentioned, the city of Providence conducted its greenhouse gas inventory, and we use the Global Protocol for Greenhouse Gas Inventories, which has standardized the process around the world, or at least that's the goal. Cities are often measuring this initially very, very differently. So it's important to standardize that so you could actually compare city to city and know how you're doing relative to others. And Providence, like most US cities, found that buildings actually account for the majority of our greenhouse gas emissions. So in this case, in our case, it's the commercial and industrial energy, and then the green, and then the orange for residential. So that's how much energy our commercial buildings, our industrial buildings, and residential buildings are consuming. And that accounts for about 70% of our total greenhouse gas emissions. The next greatest sector is transportation, which for us is about another 20 to 30%. And then the rest is very, very small. And that includes waste, solid waste, and water management. And the reason that waste is so small, and that's based on how we're calculating it. The only way that we're able to measure emissions from waste is the how we're actually managing it and the processing of that waste once it's done beyond its useful life. So what it doesn't account for is all the energy and the industry and industrial processes that went into creating that product. And as you know, the U.S. is a very consumer-driven economy and very wasteful in that way. And so we're unfortunately haven't really figured out how to measure that. And so it's difficult to translate into policy because these baselines are essential for setting the policy. So we're working on an improved methodology to do that, but that's still a work in progress. So as I mentioned, the next step is to set these sector-specific targets so you know what types of policies you need to be working on. This is an example from the city of Boston. So neighborhoods, the neighborhood section included residential energy. So we went ahead and calculated, we understood a little estimations on how much a home energy audit would translate to energy savings and figured out how many home energy audits we need to have done by, in this case, 2020, which was our interim target, to put us on track to meeting our goals. So what's really important here for the targets is to translate these big sort of monster goals into actionable items so residents can look at the plan and understand, okay, I see my role in this plan and understand how I can contribute. So here's an example, just another example from the city of Austin, Texas. They have their greenhouse gas inventory here. So it's transportation at 36%, energy, again, sort of similar to Providence as the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. And then waste and industrial processes are the smaller slices. And they mapped out exactly how each of those sectors, energy, transportation in orange and others, need to decrease in order to meet their 2050 goal. They also calculated a business as usual scenario. So they not only need to know how they need to emit or reduce their emissions from today, but based on the business as usual scenario, it's a much greater gap that they need to be accounting for. So just to demonstrate, it really this process is very metric driven and driven by science and numbers, and it has evolved substantially. So the next step is to create a plan. And this is where it's really, really important to engage residents and businesses and other stakeholders. We're talking about very long-term goals, right? 2050, carbon neutral by 2050. There's going to be multiple elected officials that are serving within that time. There's going to be a lot of change. It's really up to the community to make sure that this plan, after in the U.S. for every new mayor that comes in, that they're continuing to adhere to it and update it and actually implement it and carry it through. So having that community buy-in to do that work is critical. So to start that process, oftentimes a city or a consultant or an NGO, someone with expertise, can create a sort of menu of policy options that will help meet those specific targets and greenhouse gas reduction goals. So providing the public with information on what's the impact of that policy in terms of the greenhouse gas reduction potential, what's the cost of implementing that, how politically feasible is it, and then what are the co-benefits for the community, so the community can make informed decisions about what policies are appropriate for their local context. And then prioritizing those and making decisions about what ultimately gets into the plan. And then next on to implementation. So here you want to solidify those implementation plans and really take it to who's responsible for implementing it. Hopefully they were part of the decision-making process, so it's not a surprise. But finding ways to embed this in the various departments that are responsible for implementation. So connecting it to either other plans or other processes to make it so it's not a whole nother task that you're working on. A lot of times my work as the director of sustainability, like I said, it's really about collaborating and supporting other departments and achieving these goals. So it's up to me to find ways to make implementation as minimally invasive process as possible. And I'll also emphasize here that ongoing outreach and education is really important. And this sort of ties into the reporting process, but it's really essential to keep all the folks that just worked really hard on providing input and creating these policies and these programs to reach the goals, understand how you're making progress. And so monitoring and evaluation is essential. So a lot of cities are creating their sustainability dashboards, like the city of Providence has, which is online here to show, we have a number of indicators that we're reporting on, including our energy consumption, how many trees what's our net gain in trees in the city, miles of bike infrastructure that are being implemented. Excuse me. So providing that information to the public is really important. Here's an example, a sort of screenshot from our dashboard that shows our municipal energy consumption. We have a goal to reduce the energy that municipal buildings use 30% by 2030. And here you can see that we're on track to meeting that goal. So that's an example of a positive story that we like to share. But there are plenty of other metrics that we're not performing, but we're still reporting that information because it's important to hold ourselves accountable and be transparent about where we're doing, areas that we're doing well, and then areas that are lagging behind. So here's just another example. This is from Sustainable DC, and they show these are all the action items by section of the plan, and they have a column here to show how they're doing and progressing on implementation of those. What's the time frame of it, and then who's leading implementation. So again, just emphasize being transparent and holding ourselves accountable so the public knows how we're doing. And then lastly, this is another example. This is from the Austin plan that shows how they're progressing in terms of renewable energy generation over time. Again, this is a nice example of a positive story on how they're actually making great progress towards their sector-specific goal. Again, this is where it's important to kind of downscale those big picture greenhouse gas reduction goals to specific targets of how you can achieve that goal. So renewable energy generation is obviously important in part of that. So they have a goal to become, to generate half of their power from renewables, and they're making progress on their way to achieving that. So just a few examples of some of the programs and policies that are being implemented to achieve these goals. So the first one I'll talk about is resident engagement. As I mentioned, it's really important to make sure residents are involved in this process. Not only are they responsible for really carrying this through and implementation on the long term, but they are also responsible for implementation, right? If you are creating programs that are going to help achieve these goals, you need residents to participate in those programs. You need businesses to participate in those programs. And those little actions do add up, and you need to be able to document that. And because I think that a lot of people feel that when we talk about, oh, it's the small steps that matter, right? But we're looking at this global problem. And so sometimes I think there's a disconnect between, this doom and gloom climate change story, and then you present people with solutions, and it's like, change your light bulbs. Like, that doesn't really match the scale of the problem. But when you're able to aggregate it and demonstrate the impact that it has collectively and track your progress, then I think people can actually feel and see how the action that they're taking is adding up and helping the city achieve its goals. So this is an example from New York City's, which I think is the best example in the US right now of a very sophisticated public education and outreach campaign. They have a very adorable, I don't know what you call it, mascot, I guess, called Birdie NYC, goes around the city, has a very strong Twitter and social media following to kind of promote the actions and the steps that the city is encouraging residents to do. It also has an online component where you can go online and sign a pledge to participate in one of these campaigns. So this one is a BYO, or Bring Your Own campaign. And you sign up, and when you sign up to make that pledge, they'll also send you, of your choice, either a reusable mug, a reusable bottle, or a reusable shopping bag. That's all kind of branded under this effort. It also, they're also getting out in the community. This picture is a little bit hard to see, but it's a picture of at a public event, a table where people can sign up and engage and interact with that campaign in a face-to-face and a personal manner. And then lastly, they also have big billboards and other sort of public ad campaigns that support this. So what's very effective of this, in my opinion, is that it's across multiple platforms. People really get familiar with it. They feel like, by participating in this, they're a part of something bigger, and it becomes a part of the culture of the city. So another example is the Greennovate Boston campaign, which I helped work on. And again, when we launched, we had a big sort of ad presence across the city with billboards and on recycling bins in the city. But there's also many other components. So this is an example on the website there, where we captured stories to show how residents, business leaders, and others are helping to greennovate Boston. And we shared them, and again, this is building off of that sort of peer-to-peer pressure to promote this as part of the culture of the city. And the other component of that is, this is a picture from the Greennovate Boston Awards. So the city gives awards every year to businesses and residents who are really going above and beyond. And that recognition is really important to support this movement. And the last part of this residential engagement piece is the number of cities have launched ambassador programs. This is part of New York City's effort. So having those tables at the events and other things like that, it takes a lot of human capital. And DC has also a similar program where you train residents who are passionate about these issues, and then they get the information or the kits to go out to various community events and promote the plan, let people know what the city is doing on these issues, so they know it's a priority for the city, and then also let them know what their role is in the plan. And again, this is helps cultivate that culture, and to know that this is something that collectively we're working on as a city. So on the business engagement side, I'll share an example again from the city of Boston, where the business community, there were a number of leaders in the business community that were very involved in creating the climate action plan for the city. They helped shape the policies and programs that went into it. And then once that plan was done, they were so motivated and invested via that process that they wanted to continue and make sure that the plan was actually implemented. One of the things that is shared around the world is that often government comes up with plans and then they sit on a shelf and don't get implemented. And this body full of quite powerful and influential executives from the business community wanted to make sure that that didn't happen. So this group now meets, this just gives an example of some of the executives that are part of that. But this group now meets twice a year with the mayor and the city's environment department to hear how progress is being made, to offer advice, and to share best practices amongst the business community to drive that competitiveness between businesses to help with implementation of the plan. So an example policy that came out of that process in the city of Boston is building energy benchmarking. So this is a practice that is often used, for example, the city of Providence with our municipal buildings. We benchmark our buildings so we know how we're doing compared to other buildings and how we're doing relative to, say, the year prior. And that's, by doing that, we're able to understand how our buildings are performing and where we should be making investments in energy efficiency. There's a lot of opportunity for energy efficiency in buildings. As I mentioned, they're usually the largest contributor of greenhouse gas emissions from a city. And if US buildings were a country, they would be the third largest consumer of energy in the world after the US and China. It's really important that we develop policy solutions to reduce these emissions. So the policy that Boston adopted with support of the Green Ribbon Commission, with support of the real estate and development industry, which was really important to passing it, it was identified in their climate action, and it requires that buildings go through the benchmarking process and report that data both for energy and water consumption to the city, and the city makes that information available to the public. So what that does is it provides transparency to the marketplace. So you might be familiar with nutrition labels on foods. You know how many calories and what's healthy and what's not healthy. This is sort of the same mentality for buildings. And it also drives that competitive spirit amongst buildings. No one wants to be, the greatest consumer of water or energy in the city. So when that information is public, it drives that competition and that sort of natural market. So this is, again, monitoring results of these policies is really important. So this is a snapshot from Boston's first report, and each color represents a sector, and each square represents a building within that sector. So you get to see, again, what sectors are using the most energy and what specific buildings are the highest consumers of energy. This also really helps, it's a sort of foundational policy, because it then helps, once we have this data and information, now we can devise specific programs to help those buildings. And we have a lot more information at our fingertips to make better and more informed policy and programmatic decisions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about transportation as well. I've heard not only here, but in just about every other city I've been to in India, this is a issue that's of particular concern. And I think the U.S. obviously we created the automobile. We created this massive problem that has unfortunately caught on like wildfire around the world. But we're sort of reeling from that, at least in a lot of U.S. cities, where we're starting to realize that cars do not belong in cities. Cars are the least efficient way for people to move around, particularly in very dense environments. And so a lot of cities are rethinking how automobiles, particularly single occupancy vehicles, what their place is in the city. And this is an example from Times Square in New York City, where under Mayor Bloomberg, it's a great story because his transportation, chief of transportation, came to him and said, I think we should close and take away a road through Times Square. Times Square is notoriously congested. It's loud. It was messy. It was, people would try to avoid it, particularly if you're a pedestrian, at high rates for accidents. And he thought, so Mayor Bloomberg heard that and thought, you're crazy. That's insane. Why would, it's already congested. Why would taking away a road help ease congestion? But under the persistence of this transportation planner, they said, fine, we'll try it. So they closed off a road temporarily, and it was extraordinarily popular. But that wasn't, it got a lot of pushback. So when it was announced that the city would be doing this, again, people were outraged. How can you take away our road space? This is never gonna work. It's gonna cause gridlock throughout the city, and none of that happened. So the pilot was really instrumental in moving this forward. And now Times Square, they've actually gone away and taken away more road space and opened it up for pedestrians, for plazas, for spaces for people to sit and relax, have a cup of coffee. There's outdoor spaces, and traffic has been reduced in the area. Furthermore, traffic fatalities in Times Square have been reduced by 40%. That is significant impact on saving lives, and that's obviously extraordinarily important. So this is an example from the city of Boston. Up on the top left here, this highway kind of snaked through the sort of financial district, down to the heart of the downtown, and then also not too far from the waterfront here. And the city had actually, prior to this transformation that I'll talk about, the city had, via a lawsuit, just invested millions of dollars in creating a new wastewater treatment facility because the water was very polluted. So they had just made this big investment in cleaning up the river, which you can actually see in the background that goes through the city, and then also the harbor. And between the cleanup of the water and the removal of this highway was actually buried underground, so there's a tunnel now, and they created this green space, and it totally activated that area, and there was a huge investment. Following this big public investment, there was a significant investment from the private sector. So you can see here there's a couple snapshots of people enjoying that green space. There are new restaurants and businesses. This has become, sort of like the place to open up a business or have your to live or work, or as a tourism destination as well. And this transformation of taking highways out of cities or burying them or rerouting them around cities is taken off across the country. And so here's just a number of examples in cities where they've undertaken some sort of highway modification to remove highways through cities. And this is something that has started sort of in academia and in the urban planning profession as an idea. And it's taken a while to translate that into sort of state or federal transportation policies and planners, but it is getting there. And I think one of the most important things that's happening, or that needs to happen still, is that we typically, when we are doing a transportation study and we're deciding how we're going to build a new road or retrofit a road, we always look at traffic volume, and a traffic engineer will look at, this is the current volume, we need to make sure that we're matching that. And so it's measured, the metric is how many cars can go through an area. And in a city, that doesn't make sense, because what you really want is trips. A trip means you're going to the grocery store, you're picking your kid up from childcare, you're going to a restaurant, you're going to a park. You want to maximize trips, not necessarily just sheer volume. And highways are focused on volume, right? It's a long distance trips, getting as many cars through an area as possible. And that doesn't help a city, and it doesn't help people for that matter. We want to be, so we're working to kind of shift that mentality to focus on planning for and maximizing the possibility of trips in cities and not just volumes of vehicles. And this also connects to our greenhouse gas reduction goals, of course, to reduce emissions and reduce traffic volumes in cities. So the other important piece to urban transportation planning that's being adopted in many cities is the concept of complete streets. So when streets are redesigned or redeveloped, over time the road wears out and you need to go and repair it or repave it. Many cities are adopting complete street policies, and basically the mantra behind the idea of complete streets is that streets are for people and not cars, right? Streets are often, if you add up all the area of streets in a city, it's often the greatest actual percentage of real estate or particularly public space in a city. So these are very valuable resources and very valuable space. You need to not just design them for cars, but make sure that pedestrians can access these spaces, that cyclists can use these spaces, and also public transportation. So it's about rebalancing our roadways to make it so more than just cars are able to utilize them. And the last component I'll talk about is some work that we're doing in the city of Providence around incorporating equity and sustainability. So as you are probably familiar, there are we always talk about 3 pillars of sustainability. There's environmental, there's economic, and then there's equity. And it's the equity one that people have really struggled to actually figure out what that looks like and what that means. We talk about it conceptually, understand it, but it's often the one that's kind of left out of the picture. And Providence, like just about every city in the US, and I would say probably most cities around the world, have extraordinary disproportions or distributions in terms of wealth, and particularly around environmental issues. So our low-income communities often end up with the greatest environmental impacts, or all the sort of infrastructure, whether it's a highway going through their community, or it's a chemical plant or other sort of toxic facilities that end up in their communities, and they're burdened by those environmental impacts. On the other hand, or contrary to that, we often view environmental issues, at least in the US, as sort of an upper middle class white issue. People think that low-income communities don't have the sort of, because they're so concerned with their immediate needs, that they don't care about environmental issues, or they don't, they're not thinking long-term. But that's just absolutely not the case. These are the communities that, their kids are sick with asthma, they have trouble breathing, their water is not clean. They care, and they should be central in these conversations. So what we're doing is really centering low-income people of color, what we call frontline communities of color, who traditionally in the US are the ones who are bearing those negative impacts. And we created a process. First, we started with training that included government officials and these community leaders to really understand the role that race plays and the role that equity plays in environmental, not just environmental issues, but governance issues. And these are groups that have been historically marginalized and not had a role at the table, and we're trying to sort of counter that and undo that. And then from there, we created a racial and environmental justice committee that's totally community driven. Again, everyone on the committee is a person of color that is leading the decision making for this process, and they have been tasked with creating an equity framework for sustainability. I can't, it's been a really fascinating learning experience for me, and a lot of sort of sustainability or environmental leaders look like me, and we're not representative of the people that are most challenged by these issues. So it makes sense that we're trying to step back and empower those communities, or not, they have the power, but to kind of support their power in affecting change that will benefit them. And this is an illustration that's somewhat representative of the framework that this committee has come up with. And this is from so the Just Transition movement. That is a global movement that really focuses on transitioning our economy from sort of an extractive economy, so extractive being both extracting of resources and extracting of human labor, that leads to degradation that we're seeing around the world, and then transitioning to a living economy, so focusing on certainly the people aspect of this and how we can develop systems that are going to heal and address, and not only the environment, but people too. People need to be more central to these conversations. And someone always has stuck with me, that someone once told me that you can't really manage the environment. Nature is out of our hands, but you can manage people, and that's what we need to be focusing on. So that wraps up the presentation. These are, on the left, some pictures from Providence, my community, some of the work that's happening, but then just from being around the time in India. And like I said, there's immense parallels and similarities between some of the challenges that we are facing in urban areas. So I'm, again, just really happy to be here and share and learn from you all as well, and hear about the work that you're doing. Thank you.